There is a man whose face was carved into stone monuments stretching from the heart of Africa to the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. A man who commanded armies across 3 continents, who built more pyramids than any Egyptian pharaoh before or after him, who stood at the intersection of 2 great civilizations and bent history with his bare hands. His name was Taharqa. And for centuries, the world was taught to forget him. For the African diaspora today, this is not simply ancient history. This is the answer to a question that has been weaponized against Black people for generations, the question of whether Africa ever produced greatness on a global scale. The answer is yes. The answer has always been yes. And the proof is carved in granite, written in temple walls, and buried beneath the sands of Sudan in a field of pyramids that still stands today. Before we were told we had no history, we had Taharqa. Before we were told Africa was a dark continent waiting to be discovered, Africa had already conquered the world. What you are about to learn is not mythology. It is not Afrocentric fantasy. It is documented, archaeological, undeniable fact. And knowing it changes everything. To understand Taharqa, you must first understand where he came from. He was born around 707 BC in the kingdom of Kush, a civilization that had flourished along the Nile River in what is today the nation of Sudan. Kush was not a minor tribal outpost. It was a sophisticated, literate, militarily powerful civilization with its own distinct culture, its own religious traditions rooted in the worship of the god Ammonius, and its own architectural legacy. The Kushites had been trading with, fighting with, and watching Egypt for centuries. They shared the Nile. They shared certain religious ideas. But they were a separate people, darker-skinned, with distinct cultural practices, and fiercely proud of their identity. Taharqa's dynasty, known to historians as the 25th dynasty of Egypt, began not with him but with his predecessor and relative, Pa, who marched north around 747 BC and militarily conquered Egypt when that ancient civilization was fractured and weak. The Kushite kings saw themselves not as foreign invaders but as restorers, defenders of the true Egyptian religious and cultural tradition against the corruption and chaos that had taken root in the Nile Delta. When Pa's successor Shaboka consolidated Kushite control over Egypt, and then when Taharqa rose to the throne in 690 BC, the Black Pharaohs were not new arrivals. They were the establishment. Taharqa was crowned in Memphis, the ancient capital of Egypt, and he ruled an empire that stretched from what is today central Sudan in the south, across the entirety of Egypt, and into the Levant, the region that encompasses modern Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, and part of Syria. His influence reached into Libya to the west and touched the edges of the Greek and Phoenician worlds across the Mediterranean. 3 continents: Africa, Asia, and the margins of Europe. All within the reach of a man born in Nubia, raised along the banks of the Upper Nile, and forged in the tradition of the most ancient African civilization known to recorded history. He was not a passive ruler. Taharqa was a builder on a scale that humbled his predecessors. He restored temples that had fallen into disrepair across Egypt. He constructed massive colonnades at the Karnak temple complex in Luxor, the remains of which still stand today. He built a temple at Kawa in Nubia. He erected monuments at Sonom, at Gebel Bakal, the sacred mountain that the Kushites believed was the home of Ammonius himself, and across dozens of other sites. He launched construction projects in Tanis, in Memphis, in Thebes. He sponsored art, supported the priesthood, and oversaw a cultural renaissance that fused Kushite and Egyptian traditions into something both ancient and new. The Greek historian Strabo, writing centuries later, praised Taharqa's military campaigns. The Hebrew Bible, in the Book of 2 Kings and the Book of Isaiah, references a Kushite king, widely identified as Taharqa, who sent his armies to confront the Assyrian king Sennacherib, who was besieging Jerusalem. The Bible remembers him. The Assyrian annals remember him. The walls of temples across the Nile Valley remember him. The historical record is overwhelming. And yet, for most of the modern era, the world was trained not to see him. The suppression of Taharqa's legacy is not accidental. It is the product of deliberate, systematic, institutional effort spanning several centuries. The process began in earnest during the colonial era, when European powers were simultaneously conquering Africa and constructing intellectual frameworks to justify that conquest. If Africa was to be colonized, exploited, and subjugated, it was ideologically necessary for Africa to be portrayed as historically primitive, a continent without writing, without architecture, without statecraft, without contribution to human civilization. The existence of Taharqa, of the kingdom of Kush, of the entire 25th dynasty, was a direct and devastating contradiction to that narrative. So the narrative was adjusted. European Egyptologists in the 19th and early 20th centuries, operating within academic institutions funded by and aligned with colonial governments, developed a series of interpretive strategies to minimize, reframe, and effectively erase the Nubian contribution to ancient history. One of the most persistent was the racial reclassification of ancient Egyptians and Kushites alike. Scholars debated endlessly about whether ancient Egyptians were really black in a modern sense, a debate that conveniently obscured the even more direct evidence of Kush as a sub-Saharan African civilization whose rulers had conquered and governed Egypt. When that debate couldn't fully contain the evidence, another strategy emerged. The Nubian pharaohs were described in academic literature as foreign rulers, interlopers, a dark period, language that coded African rule as inherently problematic. The German Egyptologist Karl Richard Lepsius, working in the 19th century, helped establish taxonomic systems for ancient peoples that embedded racial hierarchies directly into archaeological interpretation. American and British museum collections acquired Nubian artifacts that were catalogued, stored, and rarely displayed, literally placed in drawers, while Egyptian artifacts from the same period were elevated as civilization's crown jewels. Textbooks in schools across Europe and North America taught Egyptian history for decades without mentioning Kush, without mentioning Taharqa, without acknowledging that for nearly a century, the most powerful pharaohs in the world were black Africans from Sudan. This was not oversight. This was architecture. The architecture of ignorance, built brick by brick, generation by generation, to keep a people from knowing their own power. Even the terminology used in modern scholarship reflects this legacy. The word Mediterranean has been applied to Taharqa civilization in certain academic contexts in ways that subtly de-Africanize his story, as if to say his greatness was somehow a product of proximity to Europe rather than a product of Africa itself. The very framing of history as a story centered on the Mediterranean rather than on the Nile Valley reveals whose perspective has been privileged in the telling. But erasure is never total. And what survived about Taharqa and the kingdom of Kush is staggering in its richness and specificity. The pyramids of Meroe, located in modern Sudan approximately 200 kilometers northeast of Khartoum, are among the most remarkable architectural achievements in human history. There are more than 200 of them. They are steeper and more slender than the Egyptian pyramids, reflecting a distinct Kushite aesthetic tradition, and they were built over a period stretching from roughly 700 BC to 300 AD. Taharqa's pyramid stands among them, a monument that has endured for nearly 3 millennia. These pyramids were not rediscovered by